G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the book of Ezekiel. I pray that it will be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thank you for coming along. Okay, so we're into session 20 of Ezekiel. We're looking at chapter 27, verse 26 down to chapter 28, verse 12 in this session. We're going to just a quick review of chapter 27 at this point so that we have a better idea of the flow of thought, what we're going to be looking at here. In verse 2 of chapter 22, Ezekiel is told to take up a lamentation over Tyre. And in the first 11 verses of 27, Tyre was described as a great ship of state. In the second segment, in verses 12 to 25, the passage describes the sailing of this great ship over the whole of the Middle East, becoming more and more wealthy along the way. But now, having reached this great pinnacle of wealth, in verses 26 to 36, Ezekiel describes the shipwreck of this great ship. Here we go, in verses 26 to 36. Now, your rowers have brought you into great waters. The east wind has broken you in the heart of the seas. Your riches and your wares, your merchandise, your mariners and your pilots, your caulkers, and the dealers in your merchandise, and all your men of war that are in you, with all your company which is in the midst of you, shall fall into the heart of the seas in the day of your ruin. The sound of the cry of your pilots, the suburbs shall shake, and all that handle the oar, the mariners, and all the pilots of the sea shall come down from their ships. They shall stand upon the land, and shall cause their voice to be heard over you, and shall cry bitterly, and shall cast up dust upon their heads. They shall wallow themselves in the ashes, and they shall make themselves bald for you, and gird them with sackcloth, and they shall weep for you in bitterness of soul with bitter mourning. And in their wailing they shall take up a lamentation for you, and lament over you, saying, who is there like Tyre, like her that is brought to silence in the midst of the sea? When your wares went forth out of the seas, you filled many peoples. You did enrich the kings of the earth with the multitude of your riches and of your merchandise. In the time that you were broken by the seas and the depths of the waters, your merchandise and all your company did fall in the midst of you. All the inhabitants of the isles are astonished at you, and your kings are horribly afraid. They are troubled in their countenance. The merchants among the peoples hiss at you. You are become a terror, and you shall never more have any being. So in verse 26, he talks about the storm of destruction here. He says, your rowers have brought you into great waters, which means stormy waters. The east wind was broken you in the heart of the sea, has broken you in the heart of the seas. Now, the fact that Ezekiel mentions the east wind probably means that he's referring to the destruction of coastal Tyre by Nebuchadnezzar in this passage, because Nebuchadnezzar did come from the east. Alexander the Great, where did he come from? Well, he came from the west. So Tyre was suddenly brought now into a state of warfare. So this stormy weather, along with the east wind and the great waters, is a picture of great turbulence and describes Nebuchadnezzar's war against Tyre. In verse 27, we read about the sinking of the ship. And the verse starts out by enumerating the content of the ship. Ezekiel mentions 8 things. He says, your riches, your wares, your merchandise. These 3 things deal with the wealthy element themselves. And now he deals with people. He talks about your mariners, your pilots, your caulkers, dealers in merchandise, all these were the businessmen. And all your men of war, or the army. Now, early on in this chapter, these were the people who had helped to build this great ship of state. And now, having built it, they also inadvertently now bring it into the stormy waters, which actually causes destruction. All your company which is in the midst of you shall fall into the midst of the seas in the day of your ruin. So the picture here is of this great ship finally sinking. Now, as the ship itself sinks, now we're talking about the city of Tyre here, as a city of Tyre starts to sink, this great ship. In verse 28, it says, at the sound of the cry of your pilots, the suburbs shall shake. So the suburban area would refer to the villages surrounding the city of Tyre, which would largely depend upon the strength of the city for their own economic welfare. They'd begin to shake with terror as they see their mother city collapse. And again, this is a better reference here to coastal Tyre rather than island Tyre. Now, with the sinking of the ship in verses 29 to 32, we read of the lamentation of the traffickers. In verse 29, the inhabitants all disembark. There are three groups mentioned here: those that handle the oar, the mariners, and the pilots of the sea. So when they realize that the ship is beginning to sink, they rapidly begin to disembark from it. So their reaction is, they shall come down from their ships and stand upon the land, escaping the sinking ship. Now, once they get on the land in verses 30 to 31, we see the mourning that they'll be subject to. Ezekiel makes 7 statements to describe their mourning in these 2 verses here, 30 to 31. First of all, they shall cause their voice to be heard over you. Second, they shall cry bitterly. They shall cast dust upon their heads. They shall wallow themselves in the ashes. They shall make themselves bald for you, which is a sign of mourning. They shall gird themselves with sackcloth. They shall weep for you in bitterness of soul with bitter mourning. So these 7 statements here describe a state of extremely deep mourning as they begin to lament over Tyre's destruction. And then in verse 32, we have a statement of the words of their actual lamentation. It consists of 2 lines. First line, who is there like Tyre? And the second line, like her that is brought to silence in the midst of the sea. In this lamentation, there is deep, deep amazement or dismay being expressed here that Tyre, this great ship Tyre, could have so easily collapsed, having been the great merchant city of the ancient world. And then in verses 33 to 36, chapter ends with a statement or a description of the results of Tyre's fall. In verse 33, he deals with the glory of Tyre, and he says, when your wares went forth out of the seas, you filled many peoples. So what he's saying here is that besides becoming a wealthy city itself, Tyre made many others very wealthy through trading with her. And having benefited immensely from her trade, those other countries would now feel the loss greatly. The second thing we see here is that you did enrich the kings of the earth with the multitude of your riches and of your merchandise. So not only were the different peoples, different nations trading with her enriched through manufacturing and trading, their rulers, their kings were also enriched. And then third, we see here, Tyre was a great ship which had been built by commercial prowess. And this is what it had become, but now it had sunk. And in verse 34, after dealing with what had once been the glory of Tyre, Ezekiel deals with its fall. In the time that you were broken by the seas and the depths of the waters, your merchandise and all your company did fall in the midst of you. So the picture here is that just as the enrichment of Tyre helped to enrich many others, the fall of Tyre also caused the collapse of the economy of its client states as well. And this great ship sank because of 2 things found in verse 34. First of all, it was the great weight of her wealth which attracted the second cause, and that is the east wind from Babylon. So on the one hand, this ship was extremely heavy and overloaded with wealth. And that is what helped to sink it, because it was this very wealth that attracted the east wind, or the Babylonians, to come and attack the ship in order to gain Tyre's great wealth for themselves. And then in verses 35 to the first part of verse 36, we see the reaction of 2 different groups here. First group, we see all the inhabitants of the isles and their kings. So these were the colonies established by Tyre, as we've already seen. These are astonished at you. They're overwhelmed by the fact that their mother city had now fallen. These are the suburban cities around her. And second, their kings, their leaders, are horribly afraid. Indeed, they need to be afraid, because the whole symbolic and wealth status of these princes or rulers of the colonies was based upon the continued existence of the dominance of Tyre, the mothership. And now it had fallen. It's similar. You just imagine what would happen if Wall Street or the Australian Stock Exchange were to collapse suddenly. Throughout the world, wealthy men would suddenly find their wealth all wiped out. Something like this happened with the city of Tyre. And the third thing we see here is that they are troubled in their countenance. They're troubled because they no longer know what their future is going to be like. The great city is gone. Where's our trading? What's going to happen? Are we going to support ourselves? The reaction of the merchants comes next in verse 36. The merchants among the peoples hiss at you. So these men who had become wealthy and were now reduced to poverty through Tyre's fall, they hiss or express their animosity and extreme hatred towards a city that had caused their own downfall. And at the end of verse 36, we reach the conclusion. First of all, he says, you are become a terror. So the fall of Tyre has terrified all those groups mentioned in verses 12 to 25. And second, you shall never more have any being. So the city of Tyre will cease to exist. Now, since there's a place today called Tyre, Dr. Fruchtenbaum thinks that the fulfillment of this can only come when Tyre is destroyed once again during the course of the Great Tribulation. Now that brings us to the end of chapter 27. We're going to move into chapter 28 now, where we're going to be looking first up at the Prince of Tyre. Now, as we started this lengthy section, we mentioned that Ezekiel deals with the subject of Tyre very extensively, and so we've divided into 4 units. The first was a judgment of Tyre, which we've done, comprising all of chapter 26. The second was a lamentation over Tyre, which was chapter 27. And the next 2 sections, which we're going to be looking at in the third section tonight, are both in chapter 28. The third section we're going to go into deals with the Prince of Tyre in chapter 28, verses 1 to 10, while the fourth section concerns the King of Tyre in verses 11 to 19. So let's read verses 1 to 10 here, chapter 28. The word of Jehovah came again unto me, saying, Son of man, say unto the Prince of Tyre, Thus saith the Lord Jehovah, because your heart is lifted up, and you have said, I am a God. I sit in the seat of God, in the midst of the seas. Yet you are man, and not God. Though you did set your heart as the heart of God. Behold, you are wiser than Daniel. There is no secret that is hidden from you. By your wisdom and by your understanding you have gotten your riches, and have gotten gold and silver into your treasures. By your great wisdom and by your traffic have you increased your riches, and your heart is lifted up because of your riches. Therefore, this is verse 6, therefore, thus says the Lord Jehovah, because you have set your heart as the heart of God, therefore, behold, I will bring strangers upon you, the terrible of the nations, and they shall draw their swords against the beauty of your wisdom, and they shall defile your brightness. They shall bring you down to the pit, and you shall die the death of them that are slain in the heart of the seas. Will you yet say before him that slays you, I am God? But you are man, and not God, in the hand of him that wounds you. You shall die the death of the uncircumcised, by the hand of strangers. For I have spoken it, says the Lord Jehovah. So in the first 2 sections, Ezekiel dealt with Tyre as a unit, a city, as a city that became extremely wealthy and powerful because of its economic control of the sea lanes, sea traffic. But in chapter 28, 1 to 10, he now focuses his attention upon the one individual in Tyre who was largely responsible for making Tyre the great city it had become. And that was the human ruler of Tyre, whom Ezekiel addresses as the Prince of Tyre. So in verse 1, the word of Jehovah comes to him, and he is to address a new prophecy to a new individual. Now, these first 10 verses are concerned with the human ruler of Tyre called the prince. In verse 2a, the first part of verse 2, we find the addressee, Son of man, say unto the prince of Tyre. Now, although the rest of the world would have considered this man to be the king of Tyre, Ezekiel is told by God to give this man a lesser title. So he's not king, but prince. Hebrew word here is in the gid, which means a chief leader, because this ruler of Tyre is going to be distinguished from the real king of Tyre, whom Ezekiel will be dealing with later in this same chapter in verses 11 to 19. So the world would call this man the king of Tyre, but God gives him the lesser title of prince. And this is because, as we're going to see, the real power behind the throne does not really lie with the visible person sitting on the throne in Tyre, but it lies with an invisible being who is the true power behind the throne. Now, this discussion about the Prince of Tyre in verses 1 to 10 becomes something of a bit of a prelude to the discussion on the real king of Tyre in verses 11 to 19. So for now, let's remember this one point, that from the human perspective, this individual would have been referred to by humanity as a king of Tyre. As far as the nations were concerned, he was the power of Tyre. But God gives him a lesser title for reasons that we're going to see as we go into the next section. Now, from history, we know who this particular prince of Tyre was. He was a man called Ithobal II. Ithobal II, Josephus calls him by his Greek name of Ithobalus II, but it's the same guy, same person. Ithobal was his Phoenician or Canaanite name. In the second part of verse 2, we read that the specific sin which the prince of Tyre was guilty of was self-deification. He says, because your heart is lifted up. And the root cause of his self-deification was a sin of pride. And this will be one of the key points by which what is said about this prince of Tyre becomes a prelude to the discussion about the king of Tyre in verses 11 to 19. The king of Tyre had the same problem with pride. Now, what did this pride lead to? Well, it led to a claim that he made about himself. Being filled with pride, he boasted, I am a god. He claimed deity for himself. I sit in the seat of God. And with that statement, he claims to have divine authority. So, on the one hand, he claimed to be deity. On the other hand, he claimed divine authority in the midst of the seas. Now, this expression, the midst of the seas, appears to be a reference to Tyre's island fortress, although it may be a reference to its control of the sea lanes, which made it such a dominant city and gave its rulers such great authority. So this expression could refer to the island fortress called Tyre, which was built after the destruction of coastal Tyre. But we're going to see as we work through which one it is. If it does refer to the coast of Tyre and her control of the sea lanes of the Mediterranean, then as we learned from chapter 27, it was this control that made Tyre so great and wealthy, and in turn gave its rulers such status and authority, which in turn led to his declaration of being God and having the authority of God. But further on in verse 2, second part of verse 2, the truth is the exact opposite. Yet you are a man and not God, though you did set your heart as the heart of God. So the truth of the matter is that this prince of Tyre, who thinks that he is God and who thinks that he has divine authority, is really not a God, but he's just a mere man. And he'll have his humanity clearly proved in the verses to come. Now, by Jewish tradition, this prince of Tyre is Hiram, the same man who'd been a friend of King David and who had sold cedars of Lebanon to Solomon for the building of the temple. Now, this is all rabbinic legend, okay? So according to rabbinic legend, Hiram lived for centuries and was still living after the fall of Israel in the days of Ezekiel and Daniel. And whereas he was right, this is their legend, And whereas he was righteous in the days of David and Solomon, in later years, because he'd lived so long, he thought he'd become immortal because of his longevity, and he felt he must be God. It was this that brought an end to his long life by divine judgment. But although he is Hiram in rabbinic legend, in actual history, it's not Hiram, it's actually Ithabal II, all right? It's Ithabal II, not Hiram. Hiram is just a rabbinic legend. Now, in verses 3 to 5, verse 5, Ezekiel then describes the great wisdom of this prince of Tyre. And first of all, we see in verse 3, he compares him with Daniel. Behold, you are wiser than Daniel. Now, Daniel was still alive at this point, and whereas Ezekiel was outside the city of Babylon, Daniel was living inside Babylon. It's rather evident from this that Daniel and his wisdom had become very famous as Ezekiel's contemporary. This very statement about Ithabal II shows how well Daniel's wisdom had become known by this time in the ancient world. Daniel's great wisdom is described in 3 places in his book of Daniel. In chapter 1, verses 19 to 20, in chapter 2, verse 48, and chapter 5, verse 11 and 14. Now, in spite of Daniel's tremendous wisdom, the wisdom of this prince of Tyre was superior even to the wisdom of Daniel. So that this verse goes on to say, there is no secret that is hidden from you. And this expression refers to the ability to reveal secrets and to solve riddles. So this is an ability we know that Daniel had. We find this in Daniel 2, verse 47, and Daniel 4, verse 9, Daniel 5, 12, and 16. They both had the same ability, but the prince of Tyre was superior to Daniel in this sphere. So in comparison with Daniel, the prince of Tyre had even greater wisdom and also had a greater ability in resolving problems and in the solving of various riddles. And then in verse 4 to 5, we read about what he achieved as a result of his wisdom. The main thing he achieved through his wisdom was wealth. In verse 4, the prince says, by your wisdom and by your understanding, you have gotten your riches and have gotten gold and silver into your treasuries, or into your treasures. So this shows us how the prince of Tyre used his wisdom to gain some initial capital, if you like. And once he had that, it led to a second achievement in the first part of verse 5. By your great wisdom and by your traffic have you increased your riches. So his initial capital or finance wealth that was gained by wisdom in verse 4 had been now used for reinvestment in order to gain even greater wealth. And by further application of his wisdom, the prince of Tyre had gained more riches beyond that which he had amassed in verse 4. If the words traffic by traffic here refer to his merchant fleet, since the word traffic here means to go from one place to another, then it pictures his ships going from port to port throughout the Middle East, establishing colonies. Now, the Hebrew word chahil for wealth here can also mean power, and of course, well, power usually comes with wealth anyway. By their very nature, those who are very wealthy have a lot of power as well. Now, whereas Daniel used his wisdom in order to glorify God, the prince of Tyre used his wisdom to glorify himself and the city over which he reigned and to increase his wealth. So in the end of verse 5, the result of this improper use of wisdom was pride. He says, your heart was lifted up because of your riches. So he began to look around himself with wrong aspirations. He began to meditate upon matters in a wrong way, perceiving that it was his own wisdom that had gained for him all this wealth and power. And this led on to his self-declaration of the deity mentioned in verse 2. Because as he looked upon all that he had achieved by his wisdom, he declared himself to be God, having full divine authority. Because have a look what I've achieved. I must be God. In verses 6 to 10, Ezekiel then deals with the punishment of the prince of Tyre. In verse 6, we have the cause. Therefore, what's the therefore? It's summarizing verses 2 to 5. Because of all these sins of pride, of setting his heart as the heart of God, and especially because of his self-deification, in verse 7, he prophesies the destruction of Tyre by bringing upon them the Babylonians. Behold, I will bring strangers upon you, the terrible of the nations. The terrible of the nations. Now, who are they? Well, we know from other passages that this phrase, the terrible of the nations, is a specific reference to the Babylonians. We know this from further on in Ezekiel chapter 30, verse 11, Ezekiel 31, verse 12, and Ezekiel 32, verse 12. So the terrible of the nations is Nebuchadnezzar in particular and the Babylonians in general. Another parallel passage to this would be Habakkuk chapter 1, verses 6 to 8. Habakkuk 1, it's on your screen there, 6 to 8. Now, getting back to what we discussed earlier about being in the midst of the seas, because in this context now, Ezekiel is dealing with the Babylonian destruction as the terrible of the nation. So this makes it clear. So rather than taking the expression in the midst of the seas as referring to the island of Tyre, which was in the sea, which was destroyed by Alexander the Great, this would be a better reference to coastal Tyre and her control of the seagoing traffic of the Mediterranean, the sea lanes. And then when God brings the Babylonians against Tyre in verse 7, then will come her destruction. First of all, they will draw their swords against the beauty of your wisdom. And in the end, the great wisdom of the prince of Tyre will not be sufficient to save his city, although it looked that way for a while. The wisdom of Ithobal II did succeed in withstanding a 13-year Babylonian siege, so he was pretty smart because he was able to do that. And this was most likely the factor in holding Nebuchadnezzar at bay for so long, was because of his wisdom. But eventually, even after 13 years, thanks to the patience of the Babylonians, they did draw their swords against the beauty of his wisdom. Prince of Tyre's wisdom was also used to beautify this city. Its beautiful aspects were a product of the application of his ability. But now, with coastal Tyre being destroyed, the beauty vanishes, as does the wisdom of this prince. So secondly, they shall defile your brightness. Now, this brightness of the prince of Tyre was his wisdom, which gained him his wealth, which then led to his pride, which then led to his self-deification of declaration of deity. All of that is about to be defiled. And the extent of this defilement is spelled out in verses 8 to 10, where Ezekiel now discusses the death of the prince of Tyre. In verse 8, he describes the death itself. They shall bring you down to the pit, or into the pit, sorry. The term pit is a specific alternative for Sheol. Sheol is Hebrew, or Hades, hell, nether parts of the earth. Since one must die in order to enter Sheol or Hades, this implies that this man who thought he was God is going to die. In the second statement, this is made clear without any shadow of doubt. It says, you shall die the death of them that are slain. Now, in the Hebrew text, the word mamot, M-I-M-O-P, there it is, for death is in the plural. Grammatically, it is an intensive plural. It means deaths, multiple deaths. And this always signifies an extremely violent death. We see this plural usage in Isaiah 53, verse 9, where it speaks of the death of the Messiah, who did indeed die a very terrible and violent death. It's also used in this way in Jeremiah 16, verse 4. So the prince of Tyre will not just die suddenly as by the thrust of a sword. The picture here is that he will die a very agonizing death. Perhaps he might have to undergo a lengthy period of torture or whatever, but he will die the deaths of them that are slain, a very violent death. And in verse 8, he will die this very violent death in the heart of the seas. So this shows us that he'll meet his horrendous death in the very place of his pride and power, according to verse 2, because he said of himself, I am a God. I sit in the seat of God in the midst of the seas. I control everything. Now, in the place over which his pride gloated, and in the place where he declared himself to be God, there his weak humanity will become clearly evident, because in this very same place, he's going to die. Now, this is going to lead to a taunting of him in verse 9 of this particular individual here. Will you yet say before him that slays you, I am God? But you're a man and not God, in the hand of him that wounds you. Hebrew word here translated wounds you really means profanes you. Profanes you. While he was at the zenith of his power and pomp in verse 2, he could proclaim himself to be God, and no one would dare to challenge his assertions. But now that the Babylonians have made the breach and have overrun the city and have begun to slay the inhabitants, and now that their prince is undergoing his torturous death, is he still going to continue to claim to be God? He'd be kidding himself if he was going to proclaim himself to be God. His very death will indeed show that he is a man and not God. And this will be proven by the one who wounds or profanes him. And the circumstances surrounding his death would be like profaning a sanctuary or the temple. And because of his self-declaration of deity, his death would be a profaning of his claim. In verse 10, we read about the nature of his execution. You shall die the death of the uncircumcised by the hand of strangers. Now, from a Jewish perspective, to die the death of the uncircumcised was a profaning and pitiful death indeed. It would be considered an almost worthless death. It would be looked down upon with an extreme degree of disrespect. Then we see the guarantee that this is all certainly going to come to pass is at the last statement of verse 10, for I have spoken it, says the Lord Jehovah. So because God has spoken it, and these are the words of the one who really is God, everything in verses 1 to 10 will be fulfilled. Now, in these 10 verses, then, Ezekiel has dealt with the third section on the subject of Tyre, the human ruler of Tyre, whom the world would have reckoned to be the king of Tyre, but to whom God gives the title of prince. Now, the reason God gives him this lesser title is because the real king of Tyre is not a visible person, but an invisible one, an invisible being who once fell for the same reason, pride. This invisible being is the one whom we now call Satan. He is the controller of the prince of Tyre, and so Satan is the real king of Tyre. Now, the reason why these two are being correlated at this point is because the very same thing that brought about the downfall of the prince of Tyre, which was pride, that led to his self-declaration of deity, also brought down the fall of the invisible king of Tyre centuries earlier, or more than centuries earlier, but a long time earlier. Pride led Satan to declare, I shall make myself like the Most High. Now, the king of Tyre we see in verses 11 to 19. This is the fourth and last segment in the prophecies against Tyre, and it concerns the king of Tyre. Here we go. Moreover, the word of Jehovah came unto me, saying, Son of man, take up a lamentation over the king of Tyre, and say unto him, Thus says the Lord Jehovah, you seal up the sum, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. You were in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was your covering. the sardius, the topaz, and the diamond, the beryl, the onyx, the jasper, the sapphire, the emerald, and the carbuncle, and gold. The workmanship of your tabrets and of your pipes was in you. In the day that you were created, they were prepared. You are the anointed cherub that covers, and I set you so that you were upon the holy mountain of God. You've walked up and down in the midst of the stones of fire. Verse 15. You were perfect in your ways from the day that you were created, till unrighteousness was found in you. By the abundance of your traffic, they filled the midst of you with violence, and you have sinned. Therefore have I cast you as profane out of the mountain of God, and I have destroyed you, O covering cherub, from the midst of the stones of fire. Your heart was lifted up because of your beauty. You've corrupted your wisdom by reason of your brightness. I have cast you to the ground. I've laid you before kings, that they may behold you. By the multitude of your iniquities and the unrighteousness of your traffic, you have profaned your sanctuaries. Therefore have I brought forth a fire from the midst of you. It has devoured you, and I have turned you to ashes upon the earth in the sight of all them that behold you. All they that know you among the people shall be astonished at you. You will become a terror, and you shall never more have any being. Okay. So in verses 11 to 19, we have here the oracle or the lamentation over the king of Tyre. In verse 11, the word of Jehovah again comes to Ezekiel, announcing, word of Jehovah comes against us. Now, a completely new segment of the prophecy. Remember that in verses 1 to 10, Ezekiel was addressing a human king who was given a lesser title of prince. From the human perspective, he might be the top man in Tyre, but not from the divine perspective. There was someone else above him. Now, in verses 11 to 19 are addressed to Satan, who is the real king of Tyre and the real power behind Tyre's throne. Now, you can ask the question, since Satan is the prince of the kingdoms of this world, this could therefore be said of any throne, couldn't it? So why is this particularly the case with Tyre? Why in this case does God reveal the relationship between the human prince of Tyre and the invisible king of Tyre? Why did he do it? Well, it's primarily because of the specific sin of pride of which the prince of Tyre was guilty. Now, apparently other kings were not guilty of this sin to the same degree. His problem was that his pride led him to make a specific self-declaration of deity. In verses 11 to 19, we're going to learn that Satan also fell because of pride. Although these verses do not state that Satan also claimed to be God, but we find in a parallel passage in Isaiah chapter 14, verses 12 to 14, we find out that the fifth of Satan's 5 I will declarations is, I will make myself like the Most High. So clearly, Satan succumbed to the same sin as the prince of Tyre, in that his pride led to a self-declaration of deity. Now, these verses cannot be speaking of the human king of Tyre, Ithobal II. And this is going to become evident as we proceed through the passage, phrase by phrase. Now, we can construct a bit of a prelude by pointing out 4 things at this stage, and we'll see other things as we move through. First of all, in verses 11 to 12, Ezekiel is now using a new title. No longer is he addressing the prince of Tyre, but now the king of Tyre. And that change from prince to king is significant. Second, the descriptions given of the king of Tyre go well beyond mere man. They could not be true of any specific human being. Third, this king of Tyre had a position before God which no human being could ever have had. And fourth, whereas the prince of Tyre could never be said to have started out perfect, yet we're told that the king of Tyre was first perfect, righteous, holy, and then he sinned and became imperfect. So in verse 11, we're addressing a new individual who is Satan and not a human prince. And the first part of verse 12 is a lamentation. Once again, Ezekiel is addressed by God as Son of Man, and he's told to take up a lamentation over the king of Tyre. This lamentation here, the Hebrew word actually means a dirge. It's a dirge. Ezekiel is to take up a dirge, which the Lord Jehovah himself is proclaiming. And it is a lamentation simply because although Satan has become a great sinner and a rebel against God, yet his fall was not something God was happy with. So God laments over the fall of Satan, and the following verses contain the words of that lamentation. In the second part of verses 12 to 15, we're given the description of the king of Tyre and the position which Satan had before his fall. Now, in second part of verse 12, it describes his wisdom and beauty. He says, you seal up the sum. In this Hebrew expression, hatam toknit, the word toknit, the Hebrew word toknit, T-O-K-N-I-T, comes from a word which means to weigh or to measure off. It's used again in 43:10. We see it in Ezekiel 43:10, where the verse reads, let them measure the pattern or the sum, so that it can seal up the sum. What it means is it means to fill up or to totally complete the pattern, if you like. So the picture is basically this. When God began to do his work of creation, he chose to limit himself to a specific pattern or blueprint. Now, he willed not to go beyond this pattern or blueprint. And so when the animals were created, they only filled up so much of the pattern. Man filled up some more of it. Angelic beings filled up a bit more. But when this being Satan, the king of Tyre, was created, it says that he filled up the sum, means he filled up the entire pattern of this blueprint in two specific areas. He was the one who sealed up measurement. And this emphasizes the fact that he was perfect in physical form. The two areas wherein he filled up the sum are mentioned in this verse. The second statement about him is full of wisdom. So the first two areas where Satan filled up the pattern was in this area of wisdom. And because he filled up the sum, it means that Satan was the wisest of all created beings. And the next statement is perfect in beauty. And this gives us the second area in which he completed the pattern. This means that he was the most beautiful of all created beings. So by telling us that Satan filled up the sum or completed the pattern or blueprint in the two areas of wisdom and beauty, it meant that he was both the wisest and the most beautiful creature of all created beings. He was physically and mentally the best of all. So when folks within Christendom portray Satan as this evil-looking character, nothing could be further from the truth. He was physically and mentally the best of all. He was the most beautiful of all God's creation, and he was the wisest of all God's creation. And this is where we're going to leave it for this section. We'll continue next time. Thank you for coming along. Study hard, grow strong.